between the contributions of literary studies and communication studies, especially in an American context, to cultural studies. Since communication studies, in a sense, mediated the entry to America of British cultural studies via the Illinois School, James Carey, and then the second generation, Lawrence Grossberg and Carey Nelson and so on. And I think at least Carey is not so well known because he didn't write as much.
So the contribution of the communication school, you're talking about the English communication school,
yeah, the College of Communication in Illinois, and then I'm in the College of Communication at Texas, so I think there's a slightly different angle there.
Okay, the contribution of communication to cultural studies.
Right, yeah, of the field of communication. Since so many of the interests in the early days of British cultural studies moved from literary to media.
So, I'm going to ask you about the intellectual history of cultural studies. We focus it on the contribution of the field of communication to cultural studies. And then perhaps the role that, Orwell played in the early beginning of cultural studies.
One thing that interests me is the different national traditions that have contributed to cultural studies and how their contributions have been mediated by different groups from one culture to another. For instance, many people today have a very vague idea about what cultural studies is, and they may associate it with post-structuralism or postmodernism from Parisian thinkers, or they may associate it with something having to do with punk or cyberpunk or quasi-American criticism, or indeed British cultural studies. And in fact, that's the tradition that I'm most familiar with as having originated some formal approach to culture as a phenomenon. And so when I think of cultural studies, I think of Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall in the early days of the New Left Review, and the way in which their work later became radicalized during the later days of the New Left Review in the mid-60s, and how that was mediated to America via communication studies departments, such as those at Illinois and throughout the Midwest. And in fact, one of the neglected stories of American cultural studies is probably the contribution that James Carey and some of the other people working with him, especially in the field of communication, made in bringing over Stuart Hall and some others in the late 60s and early 70s. There was a conference during the early 70s that served as a kind of bridge to British cultural studies organized by James Carey and others at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. And so, in a sense, as far as American cultural studies is concerned, in this sense of having participated in the development of British cultural studies in the late 60s and 70s, it's not so much English and comparative literature departments working out of post-structuralism and structuralism, so much as communication studies departments that have played a formative role. And I suppose that's understandable given that the big development in Britain in working on cultural studies had been the move from the focus on literature to culture and society, and that came to mean mass culture and popular culture, and so the mass media. And communication studies in America were much better positioned to be studying mass culture and mass media than English departments and comparative literature departments. So, although probably today in the wider academic scene, cultural studies is more associated with English and comparative literature departments in the States, the tradition is actually one that began in communication studies departments and began with communication studies having mediated the flow of thinking from early New Left British cultural studies through the Illinois School at Champaign-Urbana to a wider network of communication studies departments in the States.